Richard. We're here with Richard, and Richard is an amazing writer, and he has some important information to tell us about Louis Armstrong. Richard, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing with Louis Armstrong?
Yeah, well, last year I was approached by Universal Records to look at a project on Louis's recording career, because Universal has Decca and Verve, and Louis recorded for Decca and Verve for much of his life. And so we decided we would do a box set that was a career retrospective of Louis, because was in August the anniversary of the 110th of his birth.
Right.
So this has been the first ever box set covering his entire recorded output, from his very first recording, not quite to his last, but pretty nearly his last, which was actually when he played live at Newport in 1970 with some of the best trumpet players. And we put a book in it, a 200-page illustrated biography, which has never been an illustrated biography of Louis before, and some sheet music from his big band and his lead sheets from Blueberry Hill, and so it's just, and it's in a replica of his old trumpet case that he travelled the world with. So that was my involvement with that, and it comes out of I've been writing books about music for a long time now, and I've been a passionate Louis Armstrong fan as well.
That's right. So in checking out what Louis Armstrong was all about, like, how did you go about finding out the information?
Well, one of the great things about Louis was he wrote a lot of stuff down, and over the years he wrote an autobiography, and he wrote bits of. He started to write other books about his life, and he was always writing stuff down. And the other thing he did that a lot of people don't know is he made home recorded tapes. So from 1950 he recorded well over 1,000 hours of home recorded tape, in which he sometimes talked about his life, sometimes talked with other people about his life, and he would take these tape recorders on the road, and he'd take music that he'd recorded at home that he'd want to listen to, but he'd also be in a hotel room somewhere, and he'd start talking about something that was going on in the world, and he sometimes would go back and talk about his life. And there's a guy called Dan Morgenstern, who was he edited Downbeat way back in the day, and Dan's still around. He's 85 years old, I think, now, and Dan interviewed him one day in the mid-60s. They had a bottle of Slivovitz, and they all got pretty blasted on Slivovitz, including Pops, and in that he talked a lot about his life. So we've got all that material as well. So that formed a lot of the research.
That's cool. Well, I had a lot of questions I wanted to ask you, and a lot of people around the world have asked us questions to ask specifically to you about Louis Armstrong. So how about we get some of those questions going? One of the first questions that I'm actually wondering about as well is, how did Louis Armstrong get started in playing the trumpet, and who was the one who inspired him?
Well, he first got a cornet when he was, I think he was about 10 years old, maybe even a little younger than that. And he worked for a family in New Orleans, the Karnofskys, who were a Russian immigrant Jewish family who collected rags and bones and stuff and resold them, and they also sold coal in the French Quarter to the brothels and to the clubs. And Louis would ride around New Orleans with them. He worked for them part-time when he was at school, and he somehow got hold of a cornet, and he'd blow this cornet while he was on the cart when they were collecting and going to deliver coal to attract attention. So that was his first instrument, and then of course he started to get a little better at it, and then he started to hear music in the French Quarter and hear some of the great, Buddy Bolden, and he also his great hero was King Oliver, who befriended him, and that's when he started to begin to play professionally in the French Quarter, and then he joined a band and so on. So that was part of it.
So another question that I was while you're talking about that. Who were his parents? Were his parents around during that time?
Yeah. No, his father, his mother was probably worked in one of the brothels. Certainly at some point in her life. His father left his mother, went off with another woman, and at one point, Louis was farmed out to his grandparents. So he lived with his grandparents for several years.
All right.
Or I think more precisely his grandmother, because I think there wasn't a man around. But the details of that is a little hazy. But then at one point, his father went back with his mother, and they had another baby,
Right.
a little girl. And so then Louis was taken back home by his mother, and by which time his father had cleared off again.
Right.
So the only real memories he really had of his father in the early days was he'd seen his father in a marching band, doing something, whether he was playing or just marching or whatever.
Right.
And then there was a short period. Louis actually went to a waif's home
Right.
because he committed
Right.
some crime with a gun. I think he stole his mother's boyfriend's gun, fired it off on New Year's Eve. He was arrested. He was put in this home, which is where he also learned to play more because they had a band
Right.
in the waif's home. And but then his father got him released from the waif's home. It wasn't to do this because he wanted to be kind to Louis particularly. He wanted him to come and live with them so as he could look after his children.
Right.
So he lived with his father for a little while, but that didn't last long, and then he was back with his mother again.
Right.
So that was his involvement together.
So the person at the Waves home, the band director, was the person who kind of like.
Oh, that was a big part of his, I think formalising some of, to take him from being a kid who could make some sounds on the cornet into being a bit more of a player.
Interesting. What music do you think he was listening to at that time when he was growing up?
Well, I guess a lot of blues, and then ragtime, and we put labels on everything now, don't we? We want everything to fit into some sort of a box, jazz, blues, ragtime. Whereas back then in New Orleans, I would imagine there was just music, and there was the hot bands who were not generally musicians who read music, and they were taking popular tunes and giving them a bit of pizzazz and the whole beginnings of jazz and how it came out of the blues and so on. So he would hear that when he was, of course, riding around the French Quarter doing on his coal cart and stuff. So he'd hear all of that.
All right. So. Did his voice, because I was always, wondering about the gravelly sound of his voice, was it always that way as a youngster? Or did it it's something like, how Miles Davis had an accident, and basically he kind of forced his voice after having an operation on his voice. Was that something that happened to Louis Armstrong?
No, I think he always had something of a gravelly voice, but I think it was one of those things that just was. That I've read somewhere that he may have got a bad cold at some point, and that kind of went that way. But he must have been somewhat that way, because I think if you listen to the very, very early recordings of him singing, he's not quite as gravelly. I think he just, as he grew older, he just had that kind of a deep voice, and a unique voice. There's never been another voice like it, has there?
No. Something about his voice is that the sound of his voice came through his instrument as well. It's almost like he was singing all the time when he was playing his music, which is what people are trying to do when they play in the blues. They're trying to imitate the vocalist.
Yeah.
And in fact, wasn't he really working with a lot of vocalists, early in his career as well?
Most definitely. Bessie Smith is one. I think he worked with Sippy Wallace. I think people again, when they're looking back at his life, and he became the Louis Armstrong that the world knows, and the greatest jazz trumpeter there's ever been, I think what people forget is that at one point in his life, he, like everybody else, was struggling to get along, to make a living. And if you were a working musician, if they said to you, could you come in and do a session? There's $50. Fantastic. And yeah, I mean, he worked with I think he did about a dozen sides with Bessie Smith.
Right.
I mean, he did St. Louis Blues, obviously, and
So at the time he was working with Bessie Smith, he wasn't like the star of Louis Armstrong.
no. I mean, he was getting there. I mean, he'd been with King Oliver and recorded with King Oliver, and then he went to New York with Fletcher Henderson, who had the best band in the land at the time, best black band in America. And then, of course, he came back to Chicago, and he was starting working with his own band then, or with his wife Lil Hardin, who he married. And yeah, I mean, he was hot stuff in Chicago, but being hot stuff in Chicago wasn't necessarily as we think of it today, because there weren't the outlets. He would have been making a good living. So that there's no doubt.
What was the turning point that, the beginning of Louis Armstrong, the international superstar? What was the point where that happened?
Well, I think he did the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens, as everybody refers to them, with his own band, in the late 20s. That was the beginning of him becoming popular. But he was popular not with everybody. That was a start. He then began to get a little more notoriety. He began working outside of Chicago. He'd tour, he'd play in other cities, and that was the beginning. But his first trip abroad was when he came to England in the early 30s, and that was sort of a beginning. And he was certainly well known in Britain because his records had been released here, and so he was well known. But he wasn't. A lot of people, when he arrived here in the 1930s, were like, whoa, this guy's very different to anything that we're used to having, because even then he was singing, they accused him of clowning around, but that was that exuberant performance that he had. So that was the beginning of that international reputation, and it was around that time when he had his own orchestra after the Hot Fives and Sevens. So it was in the late 20s. The Hot Fives and Hot Sevens were what put him in, catapulted him into fame in America and fame farther afield. But it wasn't really until post Second World War that he became a superstar.
Right. Do you think that because you mentioned that some people accused him of clouding around him, but he was really enjoying the music when he was performing. But do you think there was a point at which, because I know like the black community were really hard on him early on. They didn't really give him the due respect that he actually deserved. Recently they have, but in those early days it was a lot rougher back then. Do you think there was a point at which he was just trying to show his happiness just because he wants everybody to believe that he's happy, or was there something else there?